picking up just on that speech just then, I think the content, the themes of content, and the programming around today's event has been exceptional. And hopefully we can do this session justice and the whole event justice. Without, I guess, before we jump into this, obviously our session is Omnichannel World outside of home and retail, but I'd like to introduce the two speakers. I'm just the moderator here today, so I'm very much going to be playing second fiddle to these two. So, Maitri, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Selamat sore. Selamat siang, right? Yeah. Selamat siang. Yes. I'm learning. Yeah. So, Maitri Jagannathan. I've been with Procter & Gamble for over 18 years, but been in Jakarta for the last 10 months and leading the healthcare business for Procter & Gamble. So, handling brands like Vicks, which is a cough and cold brand, Neurobion, which is a vitamin B supplement, Sankobion, iron supplement, and a few other vitamins brand. But I also work with the brand team within Procter & Gamble for all the other brands as well closely.
Fantastic. And Merrick.
Thank you, yeah. So I think we're having a side conversation before this, guys, how it's an interesting perspective because we have the agency side, we have the brand side, and a media service side, right? So quick introduction on myself and City Vision. We are currently the country's largest out-of-home provider, and we have the opportunity to work with brands across different sectors and different scales. So everyone from the multinational brands or local champion brands all the way to the startups and to the SMEs, which is a growing sector more and more utilizing out-of-home as well. So yeah, I think that's a bit interesting in the sense that we can provide from the brand perspective in today's session, but also from the big picture overview sector across the different sectors.
Yeah, fantastic. And I guess I want to point out where we are and sort of start this from the top in terms of contextualizing things. We're halfway through 2023. We're sort of living through, and many commentators, whether they're economic, political commentators, are sort of saying these are potentially some of the most uncertain times that we have lived through. We have major mega trends, things like climate change, technological disruption, even global debt and inflationary pressures, all causing massive change. But yet we are seeing a post-pandemic, I guess, return to people heading back out of home and media situations and environments actually starting to normalise somewhat, even though we are seeing technological change drive behavioural change in consumers as well. In this landscape, in this very dynamic and shifting landscape, I think all that really matters is effectiveness and how effective we can actually be as a brand, as a service provider. So I'm going to throw a pretty wide and open question to begin the session, which is, do you have any, at Procter & Gamble, at P&G, do you have any very, I guess, case studies or examples of where you think you've been truly effective and game-changing with respect to that?
So I think for Procter & Gamble, the focus is always on innovation and with the focus on consumer as the boss, right? So it all starts with the consumer needs. What is the brand challenge? What are the consumer's trial barriers or unmet needs? Then based on that, you have the creative, and then you choose the platforms. Now the platforms, of course, it will vary depending upon what the consumer, the target audience is, what are her or his, habits, right? So one of the recent case studies that was quite successful for us was for the Head & Shoulders Mobile Legend tie-up, where we actually worked on how we had an out-of-home execution in the Sarina Mall in Jakarta, because the consumer focus over there was Gen Z audience. Hence, we had to create something that was very relevant for them and ensure talkability and also move consumers from offline to online, which we were very successfully able to do with that campaign, right? The other campaigns where we do look at effectiveness across the board are like brands where I come from in healthcare. So for Sankobion, Neurobion, we do a lot of omnichannel and out-of-home executions in doctor clinics or in hospitals. But there the focus is driving education about the disease awareness or symptom awareness, and that is the objective, not the talkability, right? But then there you drive it and then ensure that the consumer goes to the doctor and then gets recommended. So it's kind of depending upon the consumer barrier and the trial, we choose what the platforms should be.
And I imagine, just sort of picking up a little bit further on that effectiveness certainly in the healthcare space is really about building sort of trust with these brands.
Yes, of course. It's trust, and because again, the loyalties are quite high in general in healthcare category. So building trust is extremely critical, and trust coming from a healthcare an expert. So the expert could be a doctor, the expert could be a pharmacist, an apothec owner, right? So that's where then we kind of focus on to build the trust as well.
and show up in those environments. Merrick, obviously, just with respect to effectiveness and being, I guess, one of the leading media service providers for out-of-home and retail, you would see and be exposed to, I imagine, many different brands, many different campaigns. In terms of effectiveness, in terms of something that stands out to you, do you want to maybe provide a couple of examples?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think building off of Maitri's point earlier too, it's starting with the consumer and starting with the marketing campaign objective, because across different brands, depending on where you are with the brand life cycle, obviously there's different campaign objectives. Are we going for awareness metrics or interest consideration, or more so bottom funnel metrics that we're trying to attain? I think making that clear in the offset from our key learnings before the campaign starts, or even before designing the formats and the final media planning, is key to a successful out-of-home campaign. What's interesting that we've seen within an omnichannel context, because today is about omnichannel marketing, is, as we know, omnichannel marketing is about creating that seamless customer experience through our app, through our web-based, or through our offline store, where out-of-home plays a role. And what's interesting that we've seen that's effective is out-of-home contextualizes the different objectives. So for example, if we're part of the omnichannel physical journey, then that's a simple planning of out-of-home whereby it's proximity marketing, whereby billboards or sites are chosen next to the specific POSs that drives that bottom funnel conversion. Whereas if it's more so an app-based or digital-based sort of conversion that we're after, then that can be more so time of day and contextual advertising. So really contextualizing is key, depending on what the marketing objective is before the campaign actually starts.
And we were talking and sharing some stories with respect to some of these campaigns. They are becoming increasingly sophisticated, increasingly dynamic in terms of the programmatic qualities of them, whether it's day parting or triggering. Do you have any great examples potentially there, just with respect to driving more effectiveness?
Yeah, so I think we're also discussing this on a side note, the importance of creativity in any omni-channel campaign. So I think shifting to that creative aspect, it's contextualizing and customizing depending on your media format. You can't just simply plop a TVC on out of home and expect it to be successful. You have to contextualize it. And so, for example, what we do is we customize across different contextual events, whether it's weather and temperature, or it's time of day, or it's sort of another metric such as, we did an interesting thing whereby we installed pollution odometers for a specific FMCG personal care brand, whereby if the pollution levels are high, then in that case the ads are gonna show, please purchase our face cleansing product, right? So it's really about contextualizing the creative, we find.
Yeah, amazing. So great segue too, I guess, into the creative conversation. And we know that P&G is consumer obsessed, if I can put it that way, and consumer insight and understanding how your consumers think and behave is everything. Maithri, do you want to talk maybe about exceptional and or I guess standout creative executions from your company?
So I think again for us, creative content is the king. I think that's the core of it, and it all starts with understanding the consumer barrier, the consumer challenge you're going behind, right? The one thing that we've seen of late is, and I think you mentioned it very well, Merrick, is, and we spoke that earlier, right? So the same content doesn't work across every touch point. And today, with all the choices and all the different platforms consumers have, we need to ensure that you really have the right content at the right touch point. So, one of the recent trends we have seen within Indonesia, Procter & Gamble, is this capability of PopMe, which is influencer marketing. But what we've started doing is reaching out to our 9 and the 900s that we call, like the micro and the nano influencers, who are basically trendsetters in a small group, and start creating content with them. And that has proven to be very effective for us because, again, it's content coming in from people like me. So consumers are able to relate to it. It's genuine. It's actually, it's what they're going through. That has been successful for us recently. In fact, we had a campaign on one of my brands that I work on, Wix, where we do this Dikarenakan, which is like basically a coin rubbing thing. So we had a play of word called care. Wix stands for care, so care Okan. And then we had this influencer Inul, the singer. She created a campaign around this to drive the brand, how she uses the brand, and we got like almost 200 million views. Almost 1 million interactions, right? So, and that really helped us drive the brand awareness as well. But what it showed us is content, if delivered, creatives if delivered in the more genuine way, more relevant way, especially, what consumers want, it really has an impact on the brand.
Yeah, and look, I think it's no surprise that obviously great creative comes from great behavioural and consumer insight, and you can obviously come up with all sorts of creative and strategic, I guess, ways to approach that. Even recently, I heard that they were using biometric testing on certain creative and actually figuring out, the sort of memorability hotspots of, let's say, a 30-second TVC, and then taking that frame from that 30-second piece and actually heroing that in a very large-scale billboard, so that the most memorable part of that TV ad is obviously then championed out of home. I think what's interesting is using out of home and those channels to potentially amplify those emotional pieces. Merrick, can you maybe comment on that and how out-of-home channels do play a role in amplifying creativity?
Yeah, absolutely. So building off of both your points, taking that key TVC moment and interpreting it within an out-of-home format when you have a blank canvas. So we always encourage our brand partners to be as big and bold as possible, because an effective out-of-home campaign, the bigger, the bolder, the better, right? And that's going to have that huge impact that's going to allow your brands to break through the clutter. So having said that, it's identifying that key moment and interpreting it within an out-of-home format in a large scale. So for example, making a giant life-size product display of your product that's 4 meters tall, covering an entire wall of a train station, for example, with digital and a lighting show. Having breakout dances and also mixing out-of-home with experiential marketing, we find, to engage social conversations and social virality from that sense are things that more and more things that we're seeing brands innovate from a creative standpoint, which we find to be all the more impactful. Because when you're investing billions of rupiah onto, before any media plan, you want to make sure that you're breaking through that clutter and you're standing out, and that the investment allows you to break through that, stand out and give you an edge over your competitors.
Yeah, amazing. I think, and just sort of, I wanted to maybe move the conversation just slightly to talk about the interdependencies, right, that exist between the different channels. If we are in this very seamless omnichannel world where consumers don't distinguish anymore between the messages and the platforms that they're experiencing, what do you guys potentially see as, firstly, as the brand, what do you see in terms of the interdependencies? Are there any particular channels that work better with one another, or is it literally that they're all important and they all play a particular role?
So I think again, from my perspective, from our perspective, firstly, again, it all starts with the brand challenge, right? Like, what's the brand challenge you're going behind? What's the brand trial, the consumer trial barrier? Now, of course, the one thing we do know is each one channel doesn't, or one platform doesn't work on its own. Like, of course, historically, we've been more TV heavy. But more and more, as we've gone through, we realize that alone is not sufficient as the consumer habits are changing, the media landscape is changing, right? So the media habits are changing. So having that, but at the same time, even whether digital or out of home alone will not work, right? It has to be the combined interdependency. But the critical point over here is to ensure that they're all speaking the same thing, which is why we all start with what we call as a brief. A brief is a simple, like a few lines of what the challenge is, what is the brand trial barrier going behind. And kind of, we also create a key visual equivalent, which is what then you try to bring across in principle in different touch points, right? And we've also gone away from this format of taking the same TV copy and putting in different touch points, or taking lecture key visual and putting it everywhere, because we realize that will not work for the consumer. So depending upon each touch point, you have to tailor the message accordingly. And at that particular platform, whatever is the brand challenge or whatever the consumer, why is the consumer over there, you kind of address it. So for example, with HNS, Head & Shoulders, Mobile Legend, the intent of the out-of-home was to drive talkability. So that's why we kind of, it was larger than life kind of execution, and we of course had the same link in retail, in other digital platforms, so that, it kind of creates an overall 360-degree holistic execution.
Yeah, so creative that and channel selection that meets the moment, right? And it's absolutely part of the same idea, but showing up in relevant ways for people. Yeah. So in terms of, I guess, interdependencies and again, being, I guess, a service provider, you would be thinking about channel selection and on behalf of your customers and a lot, right? And looking at campaign planning and really figuring out how to optimize performance. Talk to me, what do you see at varying levels of business? And one thing I did want to point out was we've got P&G on the stage, which is obviously a very large brand, but obviously you would deal with different scales of business as well. And I imagine, for large campaigns versus medium-sized versus smaller-sized campaigns, there are differences there in terms of which channels you'd select and which ones are more interdependent on each other. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think taking a holistic approach, completely agree with Maitri there, is needed, right? Because we don't like to think out-of-home media planning in its silo, or TV media planning in its silo, or radio in its silo, or digital in its silo, because at the end of the day, it's also omnichannel advertising within our advertising plans that our brand partners are utilizing. But it's more so taking it a step further in terms of, okay, now that we're not planning within a silo, how can we optimize and create impact and an amplification effect from not planning within a silo, but taking a comprehensive view? For example, if our brand partners, we're working with a large cosmetics brand, for example, up and rising cosmetics brand, they're paying an arm and a leg for a brand ambassador, and all you brand folks out there know the prices of expensive brand ambassadors, especially when they're somewhat celebrity levels there. How do we amplify and use a steroid effect on that, not just through digital, when you're paying for those KOLs as well, the up and rising risers? How are we amplifying that within the out-of-home conversation? So, interesting case study that we did was we designed a live feed of live online shopping selling. So, for example, you have the KOL live streaming a potential sale of a product as we're broadcasting it on one of the largest screens in Jakarta, and crowds are gathering around, and if they scan the QR code, they can get that special promo. So it's sort of things like this that break through the clutter and can command attention of the passerbys, if you will, versus just putting on a passive display ad or something.
It transcends brand awareness.
Exactly, yes, yeah.
Absolutely. Look, I think, that using these channels in new and creative ways, and I guess one of the things I potentially didn't ask earlier on, or I didn't hear it, was breakthrough innovation with respect to sort of omnichannel approaches. I always look. I'm a brand guy, so I always bring it back to brand and the power of brand. And I've got a very famous line that I always use with my clients, which is, if marketing is asking someone to go on a date, then brand is the reason they say yes. And you can ask someone to go on a date as much as you like. If they don't like your brand, they're not saying yes. So I think I always like to bring it back to why would they want to choose you as a brand? And if you don't know that yourself, then it's very hard to then convince a consumer of it. So with respect to, and I will throw to the brand speaker in this instance, but you obviously need to know your brand very well. You have a portfolio of multiple brands. How do you maintain the essence of your brand across these omni-channel strategies? Is there something there that you can talk to about? Is there innovative ways that you're showing up, or are there more meaningful ways that you're showing up, and what matters more?
So I think overall it's firstly, I guess one thing, and for me this is more relevant to the Indonesian market, is the power of local insights. Right? Because what I've worked in Singapore for almost 12 years in the regional role, but when I've come here, when I came here, what I saw is it's extremely, the habits are different, even media habits, and even how you articulate some of the consumer habits and understanding is very different, right? So for me, what I've truly figured out, innovation is not product innovation alone, but also how do you really create strong local insights? Like, on one of the brands, we created this concept of wet brand riff. On Vapora, which is the brand I work on, we created a campaign around Kerokan, because this is basically coin rubbing, which is a very Indonesian habit of doing it. So finding those meaningful consumer insights which are relevant for local Indonesians is very important. And that is what I've found different in my local role. That's the number one thing I really believe, is to really keep mining those insights, find how your consumer is using it, and what is the language, what is the specific articulation in Bahasa for that, that you would...
So using that localization, insight, or the local insight to drive innovation, to drive more meaning.
That is the first piece. Second, obviously, understanding how the consumer habits are evolving, especially for healthcare post-pandemic. A lot of the things have changed, right? Supplement usage has gone down. All of us were probably using a lot of vitamin supplements during the pandemic. Now it's gone down. Then how do you then find ways to keep your brand more and more relevant? So that becomes a challenge. Second piece is to just be very close to the consumers and keep understanding their habits, and then reflect it in terms of both, creatives as well as channel choices.
Yeah, great. And Merrick, do you want to maybe comment on any campaigns or brands that you've seen that have driven a really innovative approach through one of their campaigns that you've noticed?
Yeah, I mean, to Maitri's point on local insights being so key, I think contextualizing within a very local setting is key within an out-of-home planning too. So, for example, post-pandemic, when mobility indexes are super high, there's actually more traffic and more commuters on the road today than there were in 2019. The crowds are there, clearly, but it's how to engage with them within a local, effective mind frame. So, for example, we're seeing an influx of FMCG brands, food and beverage, personal care, financials, from insurance and banking to entertainment, media, and studios, to streaming companies, advertise in, let's say, public transportation within our train stations. What we do is hyper-local campaigns within an overall higher-level umbrella campaign. So the key message within the umbrella campaign is still the same, but you want to dissect that within the planning process and sort of break down the sub-messages and the specific USPs that you want and how to integrate that within the commuter's daily journey, right? So that also helps, we find, with building the engagement within the context. So one of the benefits of using, for example, digital out-of-home versus static, more and more brands are choosing digital out-of-home versus static because you can actually have multiple versions airing at the same time of your ad. So we have a local F&B brand, for example, having two versions: a morning version to sell like something that's more for breakfast catering, and an evening version when it's like going home from the rush hour, right? But they're using within the plan efficiently one media, which also helps with cost efficiencies there, so versus using static formats, for example, right? So yeah, I think and building on the sense of geo-localization and local insights, we've had offline retailers whose maybe 60% of their sales are online, but 40% are done still predominantly offline, use digital out-of-home in the train stations to be both product awareness campaigns, so the ads will show different SKUs of the brands, but in the next version, also directional signages. So, 20 meters from here, our POS is here, you can purchase our product with this promo code. And I think the local insights part and sort of geo-localization and hyper-targeting in that sense is also super effective, what we found with the brands.
Yeah, amazing. And I imagine, again, a very dynamic space in terms of how you show up and how you execute these campaigns on behalf of different brands. So we're moving towards the tail end of our session, and I guess picking up on the theme of time, can you talk to me about long versus short-term approach to campaigns and approach to the way that you show up in the world? I know that there's a lot of studies, and even the last session that we missed because we were backstage, but they spoke about effectiveness, and they spoke about the long and short of it. And there's obviously world-famous studies by the likes of Peter Field, and that talks about whether you're doing long-term brand building or short-term sort of promotional sales-based activity. Talk to me about how does P&G, for instance, show up in a long-term way, and do they show up in a short-term sort of, just transitionary way?
So I would say it's a balance, right? At every point of time, the combination of sales effectiveness, the promotional plus brand building is equally important. And the balance is what is important. So if you see the campaigns, you still need to create the brand affinity, the trust with the consumers, and that will only happen if you're always focusing on brand building aspect. And that can be coupled with, of course, there are short-term tactics or short-term programs that you can do to drive trial that can be done, but it has to go hand in hand. One cannot work without the other cannot work, right? So all successful campaigns for us, if you look at our campaigns, they're all rooted on a core consumer insight, and for Indonesia, obviously more local insight. So that will always be there, but then we obviously complement that with, of course, programs that we believe will drive trial, will help us, drive the short-term progress. And especially for healthcare, there are seasonalities. But during those seasons, we do play around with some of those programs, but they have to go hand in hand.
Yeah, and for healthcare, obviously, trust matters, so brand building matters. And I think one of the statistics I shared with you guys before was 95% of all decisions are made with emotion and then post-rationalized with logic. So if everyone's making every decision with emotion, whether they know it or not, then brand matters, right? And therefore, long-term, sustained, consistent messaging that feels very familiar, that feels very safe and trusted would be, I think what's probably interesting and potentially for the audience too, when you get into the portfolio of potentially some of the brands, what is the ratio mix? I mean, am I getting too specific in terms of it's 80% brand building and 20% sales and promotional tactics, and is there a golden rule, or is it every brand specific, every brief specific?
It's always brand specific, right? Because each brand is in a different, has a different barrier, a different challenge. It all depends on what the brand challenges are, the consumer challenge actually, what the consumer wants. Based on that, the balance could be different, but it has to be a balance. Eventually, in the long run, it has to be a very, golden balance, but the numbers will of course differ.
And Merrick, long versus short, what are you seeing out there in terms of exceptional long-term plays versus brands that are showing up in short-term and very effective sales and promotional ways? Have you got any standout examples?
Sure. Differs for short answer is that it differs across the brand size and the brand life cycle, where you are at the brand life cycle. So obviously for more established brands, we'll see very much what Maitri has mentioned earlier, very focused on the brand, a mix between the long-term and the short-term end. But typically for the newer brands and startup brands, it's still a very heavy awareness play, whereby it's top funnel metrics and the awareness are, the KPIs are very clear. It's very much on the awareness side. And that's just about dominating and being as big and bold as possible and being as out-of-home omnichannel as possible in all the different formats. So, when you're leaving your home, you see you on the billboard on the highway. And then when you get in the city before work, you'll see another LED with the same sort of content. When you're on your daily commute, you'll see it again. And multiple touch points throughout the day that sort of ingrain that brand messaging into the audience and into the consumer for effective purposes. And then, whereas with the more established brands, we're seeing more mid-funnel and bottom funnel, unless it's for a new SKU or a new variant within it. But overall, best practices, from my view, based on the different learnings we've had across the different brands, is striking the right balance between the long-term and short-term. Because 60% of audiences, interesting fact, like 60% of audiences actually expect large brand champions, category leaders, to be on out-of-home. So that's an expectation that they have because they associate it with brand prestige and building trust and enhancing that trust. But at the same time, it's how to be mindful of that budget and tweaking the right mix so that you hit your ROI metrics without going over budget, of course.
Yeah, fantastic. So, look, I think we've sort of reached the end of our discussion today. But look, I think it's really fascinating, and certainly I loved the dynamic between you two being, I guess, on I'm not going to say opposing sides of the fence, you're collaborators, but certainly having different perspective, I think helps. Did you have any final remarks that you would want to leave the audience with today in terms of from P&G's side when it comes to omnichannel and out of home and retail? Was there anything that for you would want to give advice to other potential marketing leaders out there?
For me, it's all about know your consumer in and out. That's it. And be very close. The habits are evolving day by day. So just stay close to your consumer. Understand the business, the brand challenge and the consumer challenge. And secondly, keep mining local insights. Those are the two things I would really focus on.
And you, Merrick?
For me, it's not forgetting the poetry. So we're all marketers in the room, right? Let's not forget the poetry, because as Joel mentioned earlier, it's about connecting emotionally with our audiences, but justifying it rationally and with the numbers, right? So as marketers, focusing on the creative, focusing on how to engage and breaking through that clutter in a very creative, impactful way, I think is the key message. During this exciting time, when we're all ready to get back out there post-pandemic, thank goodness that chapter's over for everybody, right? It's an exciting time for brands to really relaunch, and we're super excited for the future because that bad chapter is finally over.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you, guys. Thank you for a great session. And thank you again, MMA Global, for having me to moderate the panel as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very
everybody.
much, panelists. Can we have an applause? Joel, Maitri, and Merrick. And we'd like to